Since it is summer, I thought I would share a story from my childhood. As a kid, I wasn't exactly outgoing, but I also wasn't shy. I had a few close friends, but since we had moved a city over, I was no longer going to the same school district, which meant that I wouldn't be going to school with my friends. My parents' solution to this was to go to a private summer camp. It wasn't through any particular school or church, if I remember correctly. Anyone could sign their kid up for it if they could dish out the $400 per kid. My sister was old enough that they didn't make her go, but I, on the other hand, was voluntold for it pretty quickly, with promises of fun and new friends. I wasn't going to hold my breath, but I did at least hope that it was true. We met up at the local community center where my parents were given more details about our itinerary. We were split up into groups, and then the parents all left. The trip included both boys and girls, but the groups had us more separated, as well as the cabins that we slept in, of course. My group included two girls named Ellie and Becca, both of whom I actually would grow to be good friends with. Ellie had been to the camp before, but this was both mine and Becca's first time. Ellie quickly claimed us as her responsibility and promised to show us around and make sure that we had a good time. She was very kind, and to be honest, I thank her for that, as she became very important to me. So we arrived at the campgrounds, and after being given our assigned beds and putting our stuff away, aka under the beds and laying out our sleeping bags, we all made our way to the circular seating area, where the counselors again went over the rules and our daily schedule. I don't remember all of the counselors' names that were there, but the ones I do remember were Derek, Noah, Izzy, Charlotte, and Paige. I only remember them because they had some importance to this story. Derek and Izzy stood in the center explaining how the trip was going to go. Ellie explained to us different things that we could do with free time. Charlotte was our cabin counselor, and when she heard us talking, she would look at us and tell us to hush. She was probably one of the oldest counselors there, old enough to be my grandma, which I found odd. She didn't leave the cabin area, she couldn't go on the trails, and the one time I saw her go to the beach, she was out of breath by the time she got there. Maybe she still enjoyed it, who knows. We were quiet and listened to the counselors talking again. Derek did most of the talking. He was lively and looked kind. He cracked jokes and would walk up next to the kids near him and nudge him on the shoulder or something. At first glance, he seemed very nice, but when he would look over towards me, I got this very weird feeling that I couldn't explain. That feeling only seemed to get worse the more I interacted with him, too. At first, it would be him stopping by our table as we ate lunch or dinner. He would stop by all the tables and ask how everyone was doing, but when he stopped at ours, he personally introduced himself and asked for my name. He asked me a few questions about myself, but never took his eyes off of me. I had an issue with eating in front of people. I couldn't eat when people stared at me, and it was difficult to eat in front of strangers. So, eating in that environment was difficult as is. But with him staring at me, I couldn't eat at all. Finally, he had said since I was new, he would show me around any time I wanted, or if I was curious about anything. Then he walked away. But staring seemed to be his thing. When we went swimming, his eyes were locked on me. I would be splashing and playing around with Ellie or Becca and would begin to feel like I was being watched. To no surprise, I would look over and see Derek staring right at me, confirming this when he would smile and wave when we made eye contact. This was the first time I've gone to something like this. I tried telling myself it must be normal, and maybe it was because I was new, so they were watching over me and making sure I was having fun and doing what I was supposed to. Then we had the opportunity to shower before bed. Again, the bathrooms and showers were separated, so we went in with Paige while Charlotte stayed at the cabins. Paige was always a lot of fun to be around and very sweet. I remember wishing that she was our counselor leader instead of Charlotte, who was a no funny business type of woman. When we finished, we left the showers and were surprised to see Derek standing outside the girl showers. It was the three of us again, and that time, Ellie told Derek that he was at the wrong showers, and pointed over to the boys. He laughed and said something like that he was just checking on us, and then he patted us on our lower back to head back to the cabin. Thankfully, Ellie found it weird too, so it wasn't just in my head. Why would he need to check on us? We had our own counselor, and a female at that. But we just dropped it and went to get ready for bed. But again, as I laid there trying to sleep, that feeling came back. The feeling of being watched. I sat up in my bed and looked around, trying to get my bearings back and calm myself down, but then I found the reason for this. There was a figure standing in the doorway. Based on their build, I could tell it was a man. And while I couldn't confirm this because of how dark it was, the only light coming in the cabin was from the moon, which casted a shadow across the front of said man. I just had this feeling that it was Derek. He's the only one that has been everywhere. All the other male counselors stayed with the boys unless we were all gathered or eating. I didn't know what to do. We were supposed to stay in bed no matter what, per Charlotte. She even told us that if we needed to use the restroom, that we would have to hold it until morning. So I pretended like I didn't see him and laid back down, facing him. I covered most of my body and head, but kept my eyes just barely open to watch him. I couldn't tell you how long he stood there because, as I watched, I couldn't keep my eyes open any longer and eventually fell asleep. The next day, we were playing some game in a big field. The boys and girls, as well as the counselors, were all intermingled for this, so when Derek ended up on my side, it was normal but still didn't make me feel good about it. I was sitting on the side waiting for my turn when he asked if I would go with him and get more drinks and beanbags for the game. Being a kid, I didn't feel like this was him asking, but more so telling me, so I went with him. As we walked, he asked more questions about me, including when my birthday was, and my age again, and what kind of sports I liked to play. Right before we reached the cabins, he stopped and rubbed my back and said that he wished he could protect me from the world. I didn't know what he meant by this, so I remember looking at him waiting for an answer. He knelt down to be at eye level and grabbed my hands and said, "I think we have a special connection, Renee. I could see that you're different from the other kids here, just like me. You're special." He then said that he was going to give me his phone number and email to contact him after the camp, so that we could get to know each other more. He stood back up and continued walking, holding my hand and mentioning something else about wanting to protect me, but we were then met by Charlotte, who was filling a cooler and telling Derek to hurry up. He let go of my hand and ran to her to grab it, and we started heading back. Once we were there, I ran to Paige and told her I wasn't feeling well, and she seemed to notice something wasn't right with me. She told Izzy and Derek that she was going to take me back, when Derek looked concerned and asked if I was okay. She said that I wasn't feeling well, and he called out that I was seemingly fine a moment ago. He even tried to joke around and say that I was just trying to get out of the game. Paige immediately became defensive and told him it was girl problems, and that I didn't want to tell him. I remember distinctly that his face started turning red, but his smile only grew and he apologized to me and said that he hoped I felt better. Thankfully, we walked back to the cabins, and Paige took me to my bed. She asked me what was wrong, and I wanted to tell her everything. I was worried that she would think I was just overreacting or something. I was the new girl. I didn't want to be known for causing problems, so I just told her I felt sick. But she gave me a look that reminded me of my parents. The look they give when they want to try to get the truth out of me. So I finally told her about how I was feeling. I told her about feeling watched at the beach, about feeling like we were followed out of the showers and the person standing in the cabin in the middle of the night. She thanked me and said that it was very important to tell someone about this and to never fear telling someone. And while she didn't say a name, she asked me if it was one of the counselors. I just told her who it was, and even the conversation that we had just had earlier that day. And she looked very sad but not surprised. I still wonder today if it was because she had a feeling about it. She told me that I could stay in the cabin and would tell the others that I didn't feel good as well, and that she would take care of everything. I stayed on my bed and read a book that I brought, and even though we still had 2 days left of the trip, I only saw Derek once, and that was from the dining area. He had his suitcase and was walking the trail back towards the entrance. To try and wrap things up here, things seemed to happen pretty fast. Ellie and Becca both said Paige talked to them too, and while they didn't experience as much as I did, they confirmed as well as other girls that he had been lingering nearby and making a lot of us uncomfortable. And Paige brought it up to the other counselors. They then took it to the main person in charge, who agreed that it was best for him to leave for the time being so that they would investigate when we were all back home, so as to not cause a scene and scare the kids more. I can tell you that I never saw or heard from Derek after that. However, I'm not sure whatever came of him. My parents talked to me about what happened the day after we returned, and I had to go over it all again. I could tell by their faces that there was definitely something wrong with all this. My parents also never talked about it again, and I didn't go back to that camp. Ellie and Becca said they both went to it the following year, and Derek wasn't there. They also said they went over in the individual cabins an important see something, say something type of message to everyone, and that the rest was normal. I can only assume that it was partially due to my incident. I hope that Derek never did anything more than what he did with me, but seeing how my parents would never talk to me about it, and they added that to the camp, I feel like something bigger came out of it. I want to look into it more, but to be honest, I'm kind of afraid of what I may find. I have a scary story that takes place not that long ago, when my girlfriend and I were moving into our first nice place. It wasn't our first place, but it was the first place that wasn't a third-floor apartment in a cheap part of town. It was a townhome in what was a pretty decent community. It wasn't like gated or secured or anything, but it was nicer and the rent was more expensive for what it's worth. It was a pretty typical move at first. Stressful, but manageable. My girlfriend and I had been planning it for about 2 months, and while we were tired, we knew what we had to do, and we knew that it had to get done. And we worked our back ends off getting things packed and ready. The morning was pretty much a blur. A last-minute packing up, coordinating with the moving company. We'd hired a well-reviewed local crew to help us move. We could have done it ourselves, but we had the extra money, and I like to support the local economy, so why not, right? It was worth it for the peace of mind. By about 11, the truck was fully loaded, and we were on to our new place, which was about 45 minutes away, just outside the city. This is where things got a bit sus, as the kids say. First, the truck kept falling behind us on the highway. We would slow down and they would catch up, but then they would disappear again. I tried calling the driver, but the calls kept going to voicemail. My girlfriend told me that it wasn't that big of a deal, that maybe they were having some car issues, or maybe the driver was just paying attention to his cell phone or something. I had a gnawing feeling in my gut, but I just kind of accepted what she said. They had the address and they knew where we were going. So we got to the new place and we waited. And waited. We unloaded what we had fit into the car and then stood outside just waiting for the moving truck, and after about an hour and a half, I was beyond livid. I called the moving company and they said that they would get a hold of the driver when I heard the sound of a moving truck coming down the road. I ended the call and then looked up to see a different truck coming down the road toward our place. It was older, a bit rusted, and it had a different company name painted and faded off on the side. They pulled up in front of our place and two guys got out, neither of whom we recognized from earlier. They claimed that they had to take over because of a mechanical issue with the other moving truck. It said that they tried to call us, but the calls weren't going through. There were so many red flags that were going off in my mind, but what could we do? All of our stuff was in that truck. The new driver was insistent on unloading the truck immediately, saying that he had another job he had to get to. I opened the garage door and told them to go ahead and just put the boxes in there and that we would take care of the rest. As they started moving the boxes, I noticed that they weren't anywhere near as careful as the first crew. One of them tossed a box that was marked fragile onto the floor, causing something to crash and possibly break. And when I said something to him, like, "Hey, could you be careful?" he said, "What, you paid for insurance, right?" After a while, I saw one of the boxes that they had dropped into the garage and was a bit confused. I noticed that it said Hernandez on the top. That wasn't our box. I told the guy to stop unloading, that this stuff wasn't ours, and then started walking toward the truck, saying I needed to look at all the stuff in the back, because it seemed like they had stuff that wasn't ours. As soon as I started walking toward the truck, the big guy that was driving pulled out a pocket knife and pointed it right at me, saying, "Back the F off. Just go back inside. This doesn't have to get messy." I threw my hands up like, "Whoa," and asked, "What the hell are you doing?" Thankfully, my girlfriend had seen this happen from inside, and she called 911. It was going to be a few minutes before they got there, but at least she was aware enough to do that. I backed up more into the garage, and the guy started to put his knife away before turning to walk back to the truck. I'm not proud of what I did next, but I was in a bit of a way at that moment. I actually grabbed a shovel that I had sitting against the wall and swung it at the guy. I don't even know why we had a shovel. It had sat in the closet with the broom at our old place, like it was an important tool, and we could use it at this new place, sure. I'm getting off point here. I'm sorry. I grabbed the shovel and stepped forward and swung at the guy. He went down and he fell hard. The other guy saw what happened and bolted for the truck. I chased after him with the shovel in my hands. He started the truck and took off down the road, not even bothering to close the back of the truck. Several more boxes marked as Hernandez fell out onto the road, and he disappeared down the street. I stood over the unconscious guy as the cops finally showed up. I had a lot of fun explaining the situation to them, telling them that this guy had pulled a knife on me, which he thankfully still had in his hand when they arrived. He was hurt and unconscious, but not dead. They got him up and had to call an ambulance to check on him, but he was absolutely being arrested. The officers were talking to me about the whole thing while he was being checked out, and they told me that this was likely what was called a moving day scam. They explained what would happen. The movers would help load the truck and work like legit movers, but then they would claim that they were having truck issues and would tell the homeowners to just go and that they would change trucks and catch up. They would use this time to quickly go through the items that they had loaded into the truck, take some valuables, and then reload it as quickly as possible, sending a second truck to make it look more believable. Unfortunately for these scammers, they messed up and either left boxes or put boxes in the trucks that weren't ours. The boxes that were marked Hernandez. When I called him out and went to confront him, the guy panicked and pulled out the knife, which led to where we were at that moment. The officers assumed that the Hernandezes were likely their last victim, and they had just missed some boxes. The officer said that they would try to track down the original truck to see if they could find the other guy as well. But we weren't holding our breaths, though. The odds of them getting anything these guys had swiped, which we obviously hadn't noticed yet, was minimal. We were actually lucky, all things considered. We had most of our stuff. They ended up taking all of our nice plates, and that's about it. The moving company wasn't aware of what was happening, apparently. We spoke with them about the whole thing, and they said that the original truck had actually returned to the building as normal, which was the other part of their scheme. The company wouldn't have known about the whole thing because the trucks were coming back on time. The second truck was privately owned, so they didn't extend the jobs at all. Obviously, their drivers were investigated, and it was found that it was just the two of them that were pulling off the scheme. Well, two of them and the two guys that showed up at our place. It's been about 6 months now, and the moving company did their best to try and make it right, but outside of getting our nice dishes back, dishes that were antique and belonged to my grandmother, there really isn't much they can do. The guys responsible were all arrested, and I would guess that's when they get their day in court, they'll get some pretty harsh sentences, depending on what they can prove. Moving is stressful enough without having to worry about con artists stealing your stuff, or having to hit a dude with a shovel. If there's a lesson here, well, I guess it's just be careful who you have help you move. It's hard to really parse a proper lesson from this, since there wasn't much we could have done outside not hiring these guys. It's left me fairly untrusting of movers, that's for sure, and now I keep checking Facebook Marketplace and Craigslist for the dish set, thinking it's going to pop up eventually. And when it does, I'm gonna have some questions for the seller. As a kid, my parents loved to ship me off on any summer event that they could find, including the week-long camping retreat hosted by a small local church. My parents rarely attended church themselves, unless it was a holiday like Easter or Christmas, but they always made me go to these events. It was kind of a pain, but I made some friends there, as well as a few from school who also attended it. So needless to say, we still had fun with it. The retreat usually centered around group activities, something about being stronger in numbers and trusting each other, something like that. I typically spaced out when they gave their talks, and looked forward to the swimming, rowing, hiking, and the games that we played. But one of my favorite things about this trip was venturing out into the woods at night, with my friends, when we were supposed to be in bed. It was a time for us to get a look around the area more, discover new things, and for us to just do something we shouldn't be. You know, normal rebellious kid things. It was normally just the three of us, Ben, Ryan, and I, but Ryan was crushing pretty hard on a girl named Hannah, so we agreed to invite her and her twin sister, Rachel. They went to our school too, and they were pretty laid back, so we knew that they wouldn't snitch on us or anything like that. We all discussed what night we should do it, and agreed that it should be towards the end, as we normally did. We always chose then because everyone, including the counselors, were typically pretty tired, hot, and just ready to go back home. They didn't do rounds as much, if any at all, and we could easily sneak out, saying that we needed to use the restroom and they would let us. So we agreed to do it the second to last night. And just to make sure our trip was entertaining, the three of us took a short trip the night prior to scout out where we would go to impress the girls. We all agreed on a time and place to meet up, around midnight and by the restrooms. There were probably about 30 kids total, and it was just the two cabins, boys and girls, so it was pretty easy to gather together and sneak out without someone noticing, especially if it's not your first time that you've snuck out. You know how to fluff your sleeping bag to look occupied. So, We all met up in our agreed spot, made sure that we all had a flashlight and nothing more, and headed off into the trees. At first, we were all filled with excitement and nervousness. I loved exploring and walking around out there. The trip would honestly be a lot more fun if they took us hiking like this. Ryan and Hannah seemed to be busy teasing each other, but otherwise we were all talking, laughing, and having a good time. About 15 minutes into our adventure, Rachel paused, shining her flashlight at the ground. She asked if what she was looking at was a shoe. We followed her light, and Ben approached it, gave it a small kick, and confirmed that it was a lady's sandal. It looked pretty dirty, so we shrugged and told the others that someone probably lost it while they were out there. Ben tried to be funny and suggested that it was left when someone was running away from something, trying to spook the girls. It failed. We left the shoe where it was and continued walking. A few minutes later, we spotted something on the ground ahead of us. At first, it looked like a blanket as the grass was flattened where it was. Getting closer, Ben picked it up and confirmed that it was a denim skirt. Someone had lost a shoe and their skirt? To me, it was definitely bizarre, but I wasn't alarmed. This was a public park, after all. The church hosting this camping trip was small, so they always chose a public park because they were cheaper. I assumed it was someone that was previously out here. Maybe they had these items sitting out for whatever reason, and they forgot to grab them when they left. Ben again tried to scare the girls, but it seemed to be working this time, judging by how quiet they became. We were in a pretty dense area at this point, having to zigzag a bit through the trees. I had turned off my flashlight, using the light from everyone else's and watching straight ahead to avoid the trees. For the most part, we were walking in a straight line, making it easier for us to find our way back. But since I wasn't paying attention to the ground, my foot got caught on something soft but solid, sending me straight to the ground with a thud. I heard Ryan laugh, and before I could say anything to him, one of the girls nearly screamed, "Is that a body?" We all fell silent and followed her flashlight beam across the dark ground until we saw a woman lying on her stomach motionless. I quickly got up, freaking out that I just tripped over or stepped on her. Someone asked if she was dead, and I was basically chosen to check on her. I slowly approached her and quickly realized the shoe and skirt that we saw earlier must have belonged to her. She was wearing a yellow shirt, now dirty and ripped, and underwear. She had no pants on and no shoes. I went to try to roll her over with my hands shaking when I heard a loud groaning sound. It made me jump backwards towards the others, and we all watched silently as she rolled over onto her back. After a few seconds, she went back to silence. We all looked at each other, trying to figure out what to do. She was still alive, but was she hurt? Was she in trouble? Judging by the state that we found her in, she had to have been, right? We were trying to decide who should stay with her and who should run back to the camp, when we all heard this awful wet gurgling sound coming from the woman. We looked over and watched as she arched her back and stood on her hands and feet like a crab. I was not amused. I saw no way that this situation could end well, but Ryan, maybe to try and seem unfazed, laughed and tried to make a joke. But he was cut off by another gurgling noise, and the woman started crawling towards us in the same position. One of the girls screamed, and the woman screamed back, and we all took off. We ran as fast as we could, some flashlights being left behind. What the hell had we just witnessed? Why was the woman half naked in the woods? We couldn't even see her face because her hair was covering it, appearing wet and caked with mud. When we got back, the girls said nothing to us and immediately ran back to their cabin. I saw the lights kick on in both of them, and we were greeted at the door by a very angry and confused counselor. I didn't even care about getting in trouble. I wanted someone to know what we had seen. I wanted them to know that either a woman was out there hurt and needed help, or that there was something else wrong with her, and maybe we all needed help. His confused expression quickly turned to one of concern, and after explaining our path, he told us to stay in the cabin and not to leave. The other counselor stayed in there, not that we needed a reason to leave. I didn't want to. We waited there for quite some time, trying to explain what happened to a couple of the other boys there, when the counselor wasn't paying attention. The excitement died down after an hour or so, and we all laid back down to try and sleep, per the counselors. I can't speak for the others, but sleep certainly was not happening for me. I was still freaking out, and I feared that I would have nightmares. So I waited and listened for the counselor to come back. Unfortunately, when they did, they called two other adults outside to talk instead of in the cabin. But I still laid there wide awake waiting for the sun to come up. The next morning, as everyone woke up, I learned Ben and Ryan had trouble sleeping too. After breakfast, the five of us were brought into one of the cabins again to discuss what had happened, and we all explained the same thing, exactly alike. None of us lied or left anything out. We weren't looking to do anything mischievous. We legitimately just wanted to explore. Overall, we were told that we did the right thing by telling them the truth about the lady, but we did get in trouble and had to sit out that day's activities as punishment. No one seemed to mind, though. Not even the girls, which was a relief. We had to help the adults pack up everything to prepare to leave the following day. Once back home, our parents were informed about our little adventure, but they were also told what occurred, which my parents shared with me. Apparently, the girl was there partying with friends and was heavily intoxicated. She had wandered off in search of a restroom when she ended up collapsing where we found her. She was out of her mind when she did the crab walk thing and didn't even remember doing it. The counselors found her and took her back to the park ranger's post, who was able to find her group to go pick her up. Thankfully, she turned out fine. I was still scolded for sneaking out and was not allowed to go the next year, but that was fine by me. She still gave me nightmares for a few following weeks. I'm glad that there was nothing actually wrong with her, and I know it was a public park, but I hope she realizes that she scared the hell out of 5 little kids. In late autumn, my friends and I decided to have one last bonfire before the winter chills set in. One last chance to get out and be stupid at night before it got too cold or started snowing. None of us are fans of winter. We're definitely a summer flock, so we were wanting to squeeze one more good night out of the season. We had a usual spot where we would get together, part of the property owned by Sarah's grandparents, out behind our little cabin-like thing that they have going on. It's secluded and quiet. There aren't any city lights or people to deal with, just the 4 of us and the fire and the wilderness. That night started off great. We set up our tents, got a decent pile of wood and sticks to burn, and got the fire going as the sun was starting to set. My boyfriend, Kenneth, did most of the work for setting up the fire as he was the most well-versed in survival tactics. Sarah's boyfriend, Les, was more interested in getting drunk, while Sarah and I helped where we could. Once the fire was ready to go, we sat around just talking about whatever and roasting marshmallows, as cliché demands. After a while, Les drunkenly said that he wanted to tell a scary story, so we shifted to that. Les went. I told some dumb urban legend story that I remembered, and then Sarah started telling us about this time that she swore she saw a figure at the foot of her bed as a kid. It was pretty creepy. Even creepier when she mentioned that she didn't make it up, that one night she'd had this really weird sleep paralysis, and swore that there was basically a shadow demon at the foot of her bed, smiling at her and just watching her sleep. It was a good spooky time, but we were all laughing and just having a good time. About an hour or so later, we were all resigned to heading to sleep. Kenneth and I started to get our stuff gathered, and when he went to put out the fire, Les asked what he was doing. He told him that we needed to put it out before we went to sleep, but Les told him to leave it for a while, and that he didn't want to go to bed quite yet, so he would put it out when he was tired. Kenneth told him that that didn't sound like a good idea, and that he seemed a bit too drunk and that he should go to bed. But Les was adamant that he would be fine. He stood up and started hopping on one foot, saying, "See?" Like that feat was something that only could be done by someone that was sober. And then laughed, saying that we could all go to sleep, but he wasn't tired. Sarah said that she wanted to go to sleep, and Les just waved her off, saying, "I'll join you in a bit. I just want to enjoy the fire a little more." I could tell that he was starting to go from adamant to drunkenly annoyed, so I just told Kenneth that he'd be alright, mentioned the bucket of water to put it out to Les, and said that we should all get to sleep. They both hesitantly agreed, and we went into our respective tents. Myself and Kenneth in one, and Sarah in theirs. I swear no sooner than I fell asleep did we hear a bone-chilling scream coming from outside, followed by a huge string of swearing and, "Help me!" At first, I thought I was just dreaming, but Kenneth jumped up too, and we both quickly shot out of the tent to see Les half in and half out of the fire pit, struggling to get up. His clothes were burning, he was singed, and his face had a look of pure agony. Kenneth yelled out and raced over to try and help him out of the fire. I grabbed the bucket of water to pour on him to put out his clothes, and Sarah was just standing there asking what the hell had happened. Les was really badly burned all over his right arm and leg, and he was just moaning in pain. After a few moments, he was able to finally tell us what happened. Apparently, he had needed to empty his bladder, and he thought that it would be funny to pee on the fire. He had stood up and fully managed to trip over the stump that we used as a chair, and landed straight into the fire pit. Since he was way too inebriated, he flailed and struggled to get out of the fire, not able to focus on his movements with the pain that was surging through his body at that time. That's when he screamed. He'd been in the fire, a well-built fire that was still pretty large, for several moments, before it occurred to him that he could scream for help. Kenneth said that we needed to get him to the hospital immediately, and that the burns on his leg were severe. Sarah grabbed a blanket and wrapped him up in it, careful to avoid his arm. I put out the fire with the remaining water. Thankfully, this was property that belonged to Sarah's grandparents, so we could leave the tents and not have to spend time packing up. We all got in the Jeep, Les and Sarah sitting in the back, me and Kenneth in the front. Every bump and jolt caused Les to groan in agony. Kenneth tried to slow down over every obvious rough patch, but it really didn't matter. When we finally arrived at the emergency room, the staff rushed Les inside. We all sat in the waiting room hoping that he wouldn't be too badly messed up. After a couple of hours later, one of the doctors came out to talk to us about Les. He had mostly second-degree burns, but at least partial third-degree burns on his leg. The fact that he was drunk may have actually helped him not be in severe agony, and he was lucky that he didn't spend any more time struggling in the fire, because it could have been much, much worse. They got him patched up and led us back to see him. Much to our surprise, when we walked in, he actually laughed and said, "Yo, guys, am I the biggest dumbass or what?" We spent the rest of the weekend visiting Les to make sure he was recovering. They kept him over the night to make sure that his severe burns, which were only about 5% of the entire area, didn't get infected, and were tended to properly. The next morning, when he finally sobered up, Les mentioned that he was definitely in a lot of pain, but that he was probably going to be okay. He was apologetic for ruining our little camping trip, but we were just glad that he was fine. Surprisingly, that was the last time I ever saw Les drunk. He definitely was more controlled with his drinking. He has some pretty bad scars on him now from it, but I think he took it as a lesson. Don't get drunk and play with fire, no matter how funny you think it'll be. Hello all. I recently made a post of an experience I had in astral projection, which I'll link here. I haven't written any real experiences beside that one, and after the feedback I received from it, it encouraged me to be open about other real-world situations that have happened to me. I tend to stay away from relating these kinds of experiences because they aren't very measurable in our current understanding of the world. I shy away from relating these experiences for a fear of what people may think. After posting to Astral Projection, though, I felt a sense of relief in doing so, and the community has been very kind and resourceful. To give background on paranormal experiences in my life, there have been a handful of instances that have happened to me that will forever stick with me. I do feel I have an innate connection to otherworldly phenomena. I don't say this to sound arrogant or pompous, I say this to reveal that I consider myself open to things beyond our realm of understanding, and that by being open to it, experiences or things are able to manifest. While previous experiences had happened before this specific one, this one in particular had me shook. I've thought about keeping specific details a little under wraps. I don't know if it's right that I speak about things that make people want to check it out, or inquire with the property that could be tied back to me and would give them a headache. I'm not saying anyone would do this, I just would like to keep my relationship in good standing. This is also in part because it is tied to my career. I will do my best to give as much detail as possible without compromising this. It was December in Cincinnati, Ohio, in 2018 on the verge of 2019. During this time period, I was contracting at a particular place that necessitated staying a year in Cincinnati. I was living at a spot on Mount Adams. Cincinnati was an absolutely gorgeous city. I truly loved it there. It had a small city feel with a very nice community of people that were passionate about the city. For me, it felt like so much energy had been around a long time, long before our current society exists there today. I say this to let people know that there was something about Cincinnati that, for the first time in my life, had given me the most paranormal experiences I have ever had from living anywhere else. I've lived in Texas, Chicago, New York City, Indiana. To be honest, all of these places I have lived haven't offered me paranormal experiences in the way that visiting a couple of other places have. The first experience I had was at someone's home in New Jersey, and another experience in a condo in Sarasota. Around 9 p.m., I arrived at a coworker's spot, which was also located on Mount Adams, in a different location. It was a holiday party where a group of us gathered. It was an apartment complex, and their unit was located on the top third floor of a building. I looked into the building recently through the city's tax records, and the report gives the insight that it was built in the 1920s. The internals of the building that I saw heading up to their unit reflected renovations that probably occurred in the 70s or 80s. Rundown carpet lined the hallways and stairs. Doors had been replaced with cheap orange-colored laminate oak siding. Banisters had been repainted to match the doors, and some of the building had left Art Deco wood engravings from the time it was built in corners that lived on. The interior of the unit had been the most renovated, with hardwood flooring, updated kitchen appliances, lighting, electrical sockets, etc. As soon as you walked into the unit, a large living room opened up with a window to the left that viewed the street. To the right, you could see an entryway that led into the kitchen, a small hallway to the left of the kitchen that led to the bathroom and eventually the bedroom. About 10 people in total showed up to this holiday party, and it never felt overly cramped. It was probably around 800 square feet the units sat around. As time moved on, we found ourselves in different locations of the units to interact with people. I eventually made it into the kitchen and sat at a table and had a conversation with someone. It felt damp in there. Something was off about it. And the longer I sat there, the more I began to wonder what it was about this kitchen that was so odd. My eyes wandered around until they eventually landed on a dark door that had a curtain over a glass window on the edge of the room. The hostess came into the kitchen and I said to her, "I've been staring at that door. Where the hell does that go?" She replied along the lines of, "It leads down into the basement." I stood up and walked over to it, and in the process she said something to the effect of, "But don't go out there. We don't use that door. The people who own the building told us not to use it because it leads to a stairwell they haven't updated, and it could be unsafe." I said, "Well, what's in the basement?" She said, "There's a laundry room down there, but I never use it. I go to the laundromat. If you want to go down to the basement, you can go out the front door and it'll lead you down there too." I wasn't going to let this fly. Anytime I'm put in a position where I'm beholden to someone else telling me what to do, I feel compelled to defy what I interpret as a power trip. I also had a couple of beers in me. "Nah, come on." I responded and made a move to unlock the door. As I was doing this, there was a girl who shared the same curious personality as mine in the living room. I let her know from the kitchen, "Hey Rachel, check this out. There's a weird door in the kitchen that goes to the basement." She walked in and it was game on. The hostess responded, "If anything happens to you going down that stairwell, it is not my fault." I turned the knob and slowly opened the door. It was clear that it hadn't been used in a long time. Paint from the door peeled itself off the weather insulation and popped open. I looked out before I physically made any moves to check the structural integrity of the wooden staircase and the surrounding area. It was dark in there. I opened up the flashlight on my phone and looked around. Old gray-stained wood was what the entirety of this stairwell was made of. Brick lined the walls, and as far as the degradation of the wood staircase structure, I didn't see anything to cause extreme caution. Otherwise, I definitely wouldn't have continued. The wood felt fairly sturdy. We entered slowly and started a slow, precautious descent down the flight of stairs. After about 6 steps, you would hit a landing, turn the corner, and visually could see the next 6 stairs to the next landing. Upon reaching the first floor, the wooden staircase structure ended and a concrete staircase structure began in a straight line. At the end of the concrete staircase was a rickety white door not fully closed. I remember feeling a surge of energy hitting me and looking at Rachel. We exchanged intuitive knowledge of what the other one was thinking without any words. We made it down the steps to the door and slowly pushed it open. The open room was dimly lit by a single light bulb, uninhabited by any shade covering. It hung by an extension cord from the ceiling with an operative on-off by means of a beaded metal pull cord. Indeed, this was the laundry room, as a side-by-side washer-dryer sat next to each other on the right side of the room. Small slits of a window that led out to the street side of the building about a foot above my head lived above the washer and dryer. A small round table and a chair on top of a ragged old outdoor carpet lived in front of the washer and dryer just off-center of the above light bulb. From a distance, I noticed a pad of paper lightly sprinkled with dirt and dust on the table and a worn-down classic sharpening pencil next to it. We approached the table, and I looked at the pad of paper. I reached down and picked it up, and I pulled it closer to my eyes. The only faint words written on this pad of paper and pencil was the sentence, "Don't look behind you." written in all lowercase and seemingly dulled from the amount of time it had been down there. My initial reaction was along the lines of, "That's funny. I would do the same thing to put people on edge in a place like this." I showed Rachel, and she likewise laughed it off, but we both instinctually looked around us and behind us. We knew that there was more to this area than the eye could see, but we didn't have a clue as to how big. Above us, we noticed fluorescent bulbs in a track that followed each other and eventually disappeared off into the darkness. We searched the room and found a light switch next to another staircase, the one residents actually used. We turned it to the on position, and one by one, these fluorescent bulbs lit up in succession, turning the darkness into view. What resulted was the fullness of the laundry room. A long corridor at the end of the laundry room that led to an opening up to another room the same size as this room at the end of the corridor. All in a straight line. The best way I can describe this from an overhead view is the shape of a dumbbell on a floor plan map. In total, I would say from the far end of the laundry room to the far end of the other room was about 50 yards in length. I looked at her, she looked at me, and we knew what we had to do. She grabbed my arm and interlaced hers and mine. We began to slow and, in tandem, pace past the edge of the laundry room and into the narrower corridor. There were wooden structures that had been built that worked as private storage areas for residents on either side, and lined this hallway and created this shape. They were probably 5 by 5 units, and each side had around 7 or 8 units. The doors on them varied from solid pieces of wood to metal chain link. Some had cheap metal locking mechanisms that utilized padlocks for security, and some weren't in use. We darted our eyes into the chain link units and saw baskets filled with old clothes, rolled carpets, cardboard boxes. Besides the eeriness of the corridor and the setting, nothing about these storage units took our attention for more than a few seconds. We made it to the other end of this portion of the corridor. The room now opened up, as it was in the laundry room. At the very opposite end of the room from where we now stood was a relatively new-built standalone wooden storage locker. It lacked a padlock. I say newly built because the wood didn't look as aged. It looked fresher than anything through the corridor. Off to the right side of the room was another room. It was about 10 foot by 10 foot and lacked a door. We both looked at each other, and we walked over. I could feel the tension in her start to stiffen on my arm. We got to the edge of the room and stood underneath the doorway. I felt an immediate drop in temperature. My initial instinct about this drop in temperature was something wasn't right in this room, but I quickly shook it off and logically told myself in my head that it was just old and lacked insulation. The room reflected it because it was all concrete walls and had the same above-ahead windows. The floor was littered with junk. We couldn't even walk into it without fear of a rusty nail, wood scraps, a broken toilet, half-built or half-destroyed wooden furniture structures, a lone ratty old baseball hat set on top of the left windowsill. It was blue and orange and was of the NY Mets. Rachel leaned into me and said, "It just got colder." It felt like that was enough for both her and I. We had done our exploration. We began making our way over to the corridor in pursuit of making it back to the unit. By this time, a couple of other people had made their way into the laundry room at the far end and stood there calling out our name. We responded that we were coming back. I don't know what it was, but my intuition told me that we were not done here. I stopped walking while simultaneously gripping her arm a little tighter. I said, "Wait." I turned around, moving her in tow. I locked eyes on the standalone wooden storage structure on the opposite end of the room from where we stood at the corridor. Again, we both looked at each other and intuitively knew. We began a slow, laborious walk over to this structure. Something was off-putting about this basement, and inherently we knew it. Inch by inch, I could feel her start to tense, and I recognized the same in myself by making me self-aware. At about 4 feet away, the tension was palpable both physically and mentally. I very slowly started to reach my free arm forward. I was aiming for the door handle. My heart was racing and she was trembling. The vastness of this wooden structure started to overwhelm my peripheral vision. My hand made it onto the frame. I got to around 5 inches of this door handle with my hand. Bang, bang, bang. The reverberation from the physical impact shook the entire structure, rippling the wood. The sound waves coming from the impact shook me to my core. Instinct took over, and I took off as fast as our body would carry us down the corridor to the laundry room. The people in the laundry room screamed and took off up the concrete staircase in pursuit of the unit. There was absolutely no time to look back at what had just happened before we reached the laundry room. Once we did, in a panic, I spun around to look back and see what had unfolded since the sprint back. Silence. The door still stood in the same position. From this vantage point, the structure looked menacing in narrow view down the long corridor, lit under the fluorescent lighting. Before Rachel made it to the concrete staircase, I yelled, "Wait." I turned to look at her briefly. She looked at me aghast, like I was out of my mind. I swiveled back to the structure. "Who's down there?" I yelled at it. At this point, the only logical thing that could come to my mind was that someone from the party knew we were down here, and in order to get their rocks off, decided it would be funny to enter that structure from a different entry point to the basement, and wait for us to check it out. There was no response. I yelled out, "I know you're messing with us." Nothing. Rachel said emphatically, "No one's down there, let's go." "Seriously?" I responded. "We have to go back down there." It took a moment. No other words were exchanged, just the silence of this basement. She agreed. She didn't need convincing, and I wasn't about to lay that on someone. Before the journey back, we yelled up the staircase to one of the people that was in the laundry room to please come down to watch us from there. She hesitantly agreed and came down. Still convinced someone from the party was in that wooden structure, I began walking with more certainty and less hesitancy. I reached the end of the corridor, all of my physical senses now on the absolute brink. The only thing that stood between me and that door now was my own courage, or lack thereof. I reached a tipping point and stopped, and stared at it, all the while waiting for Rachel to get closer to me. Tension was again palpable. I jutted my arm out quickly and without thought would only slow me down. I yanked the door open and jumped back as far as possible. Nothing. Not a single physical object was behind that door. The only thing there was the back concrete wall that the wooden structure butt up against. There was absolutely no way in or out of this thing from any other way but through this door. The only other thing was a drain that you would find in a shower that had a metal plate over it with the small holes in a pattern throughout laid in the floor. I looked at Rachel, she looked at me. We both went pale white. I turned to look back into the wooden structure and was absolutely dumbfounded, shocked, and lacking words. "What's in it?" yelled the person down the hall from the laundry room. Rachel and I both turned to look and replied at the exact same time, "Nothing." And I looked back and made sure of it. Nothing. I looked around this room. There was absolutely no way someone could have made it into this room besides the laundry room area that we came in from the concrete staircase, or the staircase the complex deemed safe to come down. We slowly inched backwards, hitting the passage through the corridor, turned around and worriedly made it back to the unit, all the while looking behind us. And that's one of the most insane things that has ever happened to me in this paranormal world that I will never be able to explain on this physical plane of existence. Before I wrote this, I texted Rachel about this, as I have many times in the past, to confirm this actually happened. that there was no way in which she banged on the door without me seeing it. Her response has always been the same. I can 100% say that all this did happen, and it was not me. This memory comes back to me every summer since it happened, especially when someone mentions going camping. I swear the thought of it still nearly induces anxiety in me. Back as a young adult from the ages of 19 to 22, I volunteered to help with a local summer camp for the kids. The program was hosted by the school district, which had a lot of programs for kids in need. Kids that have a troubled background, kids whose parents can barely afford new clothes and school supplies, and kids whose parents don't have a babysitter or daycare. They hosted a lot of summer programs so that the kids had a safe place to go when the parents weren't home. I had a similar childhood, and I really thank them for it because I feel like it made a difference in my life. And this is why, when I was old enough, I volunteered there a lot to help, hoping to do the same thing for someone else. Plus, my job gives a lot of paid time off for volunteer work, which, win-win. The summer camp was always fun, both as a kid and an adult. And there were tons of activities for the kids to do, and we rarely came across any issues more than a scraped knee or something. But the last time I volunteered was when I was 22. Something completely different happened that completely ruined it for me, and plenty of others, I'm sure. During breakfast one morning, I noticed one of the kids looking a bit disheveled. They were new to the camp, so I went to talk to them to make sure he was okay. He explained hearing strange noises at night, and it made it hard for him to sleep because it scared him. I asked him what it sounded like, and he said it sounded like someone scraping and tapping on the window behind where he slept. He said he was too scared to look, so he just covered his head until it finally stopped and he fell asleep. Now, we were out in campgrounds near a lot of trees. There were also signs around about keeping trash bins closed or put up because of raccoons, so this is what I assumed it was too. I explained to him that it was probably a raccoon. I told him a few things about them and what they liked to do, which seemed to make him loosen up. I successfully calmed him down and thought the problem was solved. But then, as some of us adults talked later that night, some of them reported hearing the same noises. But they weren't in the same cabin as the boy. Other than the one guy he always tried to tease and have fun, the rest of us agreed that it was probably just the wildlife and shared stories of seeing deer or rabbit previously. But the next day, there were more accounts of weird events in the night, and they were more than just the scraping sounds. There were a few kids, not including the kid from the night prior, who said they heard a patterned thumping sound and what sounded like someone whispering outside the cabin. I could tell that they were struggling to explain it, but I very specifically remember them saying it sounded like it was coming from inside, but was loud enough to be in my head. Something about that did not sit right with me. I asked if they could make out what was being said, and 3 of them said no. One of them said he thought he knew, but he wasn't certain, but when I asked what he heard, he just said, "I don't know." The way he responded, his tone, and the fact that he wouldn't look at me made me feel like he didn't want to talk about it. What could he have possibly heard that made him so uncomfortable? I did my best to assure them, though, explaining what I told the boy the previous night, and said that I would tell the other adults so that we could check out the sounds. They understood, and we left it at that. Later that day, while the kids were swimming, the adults got to talking again, and Riley explained how one of the girls, I'll just call her Emma, wouldn't leave her bunk. She said that she heard the same noises, but that she actually looked out the window as she previously heard other kids talking about it. Emma was a real animal lover, and I believe that she probably would have tried to pet the damn thing if it was a raccoon. But she said that what she saw wasn't even close to a raccoon. She explained that there was a tall, dark figure staring into the window. She said at first the being looked like a human, but it had what appeared to be glowing yellow eyes on the side of its head, like a deer. She said she immediately dropped back down to her bed and covered her head, but could hear someone whispering her name. She wouldn't look up, and it scared her so bad. She actually had an accident in the bed. From pure terror and embarrassment, she didn't want to leave the bed. But Riley managed to get her out and help her get cleaned up. Many adults said that she must have had a wild imagination, or maybe she dreamt it, but Riley didn't feel the same. She said she couldn't say she experienced the exact same thing, but she did say she heard the noises, and the night prior, she saw a dark figure going into the woods. Some of the guys once again made fun of her for it, but she wasn't the type to back down or be offended by it. She stood her ground with what she saw with a basic, believe me or not, I don't care what you think mentality. She didn't have any idea of what it was, because it was bipedal, which threw her off. But I believed her. There are far too many things out there that we don't know about. Nothing could be done anyways, so we continued on with our day, and one of the leaders said that if it happened again, they would do rounds the next night to see if anyone else could spot it. But things escalated quickly after that night. As the kids gathered for breakfast, I could see the girls looking over at the cabins and whispering. Then some of the adults gathered around it too. I didn't want to leave the kids, so I just waited for someone to tell me what was going on. Finally, they did, and it was one of my worst nightmares. One of the kids was missing, and it was Emma. They asked me if I had seen her at all since quiet time, and I hadn't. They asked the kids if anyone saw her, and they all said no. Several of us took turns searching the restrooms and showers. We looked all over the cabins and in every crevice or spot that she could possibly hide, thinking maybe she got scared again. But again, nothing. It was like she just disappeared into thin air, but how? We had 2 adults in each cabin, and a few more that slept in their own tents in the center of our campsite. We didn't normally have adults walking around, and there was a single bathroom stall in the cabin, so they didn't even have to wake up an adult to go to the restroom outside. There was no reason for her to leave. After our search, we sent the kids back to the cabins, giving them some free time, as long as they stayed in there and 1 adult stayed in each. The rest of us reported it to the park ranger, and we all started a search around the woods. I was terrified. I know I wasn't the one in her cabin because, being male, I was in the boys' cabin, but I still felt like a failure. And if I felt that way, I could only imagine how Riley felt, who was in charge of that cabin. I remember fearing all the possibilities. The thought of having to tell her parents that we lost their little girl. The place she was supposed to go to be safe and supervised, and she was missing. It was probably 2 hours or so into the search when some of us heard yelling. We received the report through our walkies that they had found her. She was curled up in a ball in just her pajamas and no shoes, laying under a rocky overhang. She'd been crying and she was covered in dirt. But the bizarre part was that she was about 3 miles from the campground. She was practically on the other side of the park. When we got her back to the camp, Riley got her cleaned up and calmed down and talked to her. Emma seemed like she really trusted Riley, and she clung to her. She explained to Riley that she remembered hearing her name again, so she squeezed her eyes closed until she finally fell asleep. Then she said that she had a dream that something woke her up, took her by the hand, and led her out of the cabin. She said that she looked up at the creature once, and again all she could see was darkness and the yellow eyes. She did say they looked fuzzy and had what looked like leaves falling off of them, but then it told her not to look at it anymore, so she didn't. She said she walked for a long time until they told her to stay there, and she did, until she became really tired and fell back asleep. But she woke up when it was still dark, and when she realized she wasn't in her bed, she didn't know what to do, so She froze in place, crying until she heard one of us calling out for her, which seemed to snap her back to reality. What the hell was that? What led Emma into the trees for nearly 3 miles, and why? No one had any answers. And after speaking to Riley, she seemed just as distraught because she didn't know what to tell Emma either. After looking Emma over, she didn't seem injured, and she said that she didn't feel ill or in any pain either. In fact, after eating and getting to color with some friends, she seemed to be just fine again. But none of the adults seemed to be back to normal. All of us realized how bad that situation could have become, and realized the risk that we were facing. The following night, we all took turns doing walks around the grounds at all times to make sure no one left, and to see if we could spot the culprit. But thankfully, it never seemed to come back. And no one, not the adults nor the kids, not even Emma, experienced it. In fact, Emma slept great, and all through the night. So what was that? What happened there, and what did it mean? It couldn't have just been a dream, right? We did tell her parents about what happened, and while they were suspicious, they didn't think much of it. Again, some of these parents were far from parents of the year. I was too freaked out to volunteer for the following year, and I moved away the year after that for work, so I didn't get to do any more of them. But I do keep in touch with some that do, and they say they have never experienced that creature since. Hopefully this thing is long gone, and no one ever has to go through that again. Back in 2016, I was shopping around for my own place. I'd been living with roommates, or with my parents, and I finally had a good paying job and enough savings put aside to get a place for myself. I was long overdue for some privacy. I looked into a few places, but there was one in particular that I was really interested in. It was a small 2-bedroom house with a full basement. It had plenty of room, and I could already lay out how I wanted it to look. The owner seemed like a pretty laid-back guy, and the rent was right around where I was looking for. But when I did a walkthrough, I was surprised to still see someone's belongings in it, as well as a seemingly rushed attempt at cleaning the place. This was my first time looking for a place, though, so I didn't really know what was normal. To show off a place while someone was still living there? However, the owner explained that the previous tenant was in the process of moving out, so it would be empty and cleaned before I moved in. It made sense to me, and as long as I didn't have to deal with it, I had no reason to make a big deal about it. So, I shot for that place and was pretty ecstatic when the owner called me to tell me that all of my information and referrals checked out, so the place was as good as mine. I secured the place, got the keys, and started the moving process. The owner met me there, and we did a move-in walkthrough to check for any damages, or anything of that sort. The house was spotless. Everything was clean, and most importantly, it was empty. Besides a sheet in the corner of the living room. The owner grabbed it and mentioned that it was probably left behind by one of the painters, and he grabbed it and later tossed it in the bin out front. It smelled like paint in there, so it made sense. After we did our walkthrough, the owner left and I began the process of moving. I unpacked a few boxes that I had in my car, and then left to get a small U-Haul. I still had a decent amount of stuff to get from 2 different places. Plus, I wanted to use it to pick up the couch and chair that I had purchased previously. It took me all day, as I did this all by myself, but I was able to get everything I had moved in 1 day. I was going to need to buy some more things for my house, such as more tableware and lamps, but I at least had enough to be comfortable for the time being. All I needed was a place to sleep, my TV, and my cat, Tom. I started unpacking a few boxes, such as Tom's box of food, bed, toys, and litter box, and then my box of bedding and toiletries. I wanted to shower before I went to bed that night, even with how exhausted I was. I got the stuff that I needed, got Tom situated in his bed next to mine, and went to shower. While I was in there, I heard a few thuds that made me stop what I was doing. I had left the bathroom door open because Tom is very clingy, especially in new places, wanting to follow me everywhere, so it's easier to leave the doors open for him. So when I heard scratching sounds and Tom's bell, I assumed he was either running around to play or maybe was getting on top of boxes and knocking them over. It was a simple enough explanation for me that made sense, and I just let it go. I got out of the shower, saw Tom standing by the bathroom door looking into the living room, and I petted him, which diverted his attention back to me. We went back to our room to settle in for the night, and it took me a while to actually fall asleep. Part of me was a bit on edge, but I couldn't really understand why. I eventually convinced myself that it was just because I was sleeping in a new place, and just had some jitters because of that. But after some time, I was finally able to pass out. At some point in the night, I woke up needing to use the bathroom. I dragged myself out of bed, barely opening my eyes, and opened the bathroom door, noticing the light coming through from under the door. When I opened the door, there was a man standing at the sink and shaving his face. He looked over at me, startled, and I was the same way. However, I started closing the door and apologizing when it finally clicked in my head. There was a stranger in my house. I swung the door back open, now fully awake, and started yelling at him. "What the hell are you doing in my house?" But the man had yelled back to me, accusing me of being in his home. I ran back to the bedroom where Tom remained, and I grabbed my phone to call the police. As I talked to the operator to explain what was happening, the man walked into the room with a pair of scissors held high above his head. I dropped my phone, grabbed my alarm clock, and threw it at the guy. It was enough to throw him off, I guess, and I was able to shove him backwards so I could close the door. I locked it but pushed my back to it so he couldn't try to break through it. Poor Tom looked terrified. I was able to grab my phone with the operator still there and waited for the police to arrive, as the man continued to bang on the door. I then heard knocking on the front door, but there was nothing that I could do. He was still banging on the bedroom door, until finally he seemed to stop to answer the front door. I could hear them talking, or more like the man yelling and the police trying to talk to him. He was yelling at them that I had broken into his house, and he was demanding that they go shoot me. I was terrified. He got to talk to them first, so are they going to believe him? Are they going to shoot or tase me if I open the door? They asked me to come out, and I explained my side of things. I told them what happened and explained that I was the one that called for help. I even showed them copies of the papers I had just signed a few days prior and gave them the owner's phone number. I was still freaking out. They were going to call the owner as well as to confirm, and I was stressing that my first night here, I was already involved with the police. What if he told me never mind and that I had to get out? Thankfully, to my relief, the police came back and told me that not only did the owner confirm that I was the new resident, but that the man was the previous tenant that had been kicked out. The owner actually showed up, and there was a huge discussion between the three of us and the cops. Or more like between them and I listened and just confirmed. Apparently, that guy hadn't paid rent for some time. The owner tried to work things out, but with the amount of complaints from the neighborhood about things he was doing, things they heard or could smell apparently, and the number of police events, he had to evict him. That's also why the police weren't quick to take his side. He was told that he had to leave, but refused to do so. So, the owner ended up having to pack all of his stuff up to get him out. He apparently wasn't too happy about that, and decided to try to stay anyways. He had collected the key from the last guy, but wasn't aware that he had made a spare and never changed the locks. Thus, how he was able to get in that night while I was in the shower. He was going through my stuff, I learned later, because those were actually my scissors from my office box. In the end, the guy was asked to leave peacefully. He refused and then tried to start a fight, so he got a free ride back to the police station at least. The owner apologized profusely and said that he would actually be back the next day to change all the locks, to make sure that no one else had the keys but us. So, my first night in my new place was pretty eventful. For all the wrong reasons, but it was still mine. I actually still live in the same house with Tom by my side, as the rent is great and the owner is pretty cool. I've also never seen that man again, and I really hope that it stays that way. About a decade ago, my college buddies and I decided to reunite for a weekend camping trip. So, 4 people total. We had all kind of gotten lost in the craziness of adult life, and as such, we hadn't had time to really see each other or get together. And what better way to catch up after a few years than to spend some time in the wilderness, right? We live near some pretty decent lakes, and determined that spending some time out there was the best idea. A couple nights spent around a campfire, under the stars, in the middle of pretty much nowhere was going to be a good time. We arrived on the planned Friday afternoon. It was a decently warm day, and we found our spot, where we were going to set up, just off the main trail in a clearing in the open forest. A perfect spot for us to set up our tents. We did so, and after a few hours decided to get the fire going, even though it was still fairly warm out. The sun was mostly set, the sky was that nice orange-pink that it gets when the night comes, and we were just sitting there reminiscing about the good old days. As the night progressed, we were all sitting around and starting to grow tired, when one of the guys, Kevin, jumped up a bit and asked, "Hey, did you guys hear that?" I turned to him and asked what he meant. He then said that there was a sound in the woods. I listened for a moment, but didn't hear anything out of the ordinary. Just the sounds of a night in the woods. Crickets, owls, nothing too crazy. I mentioned that he may have just heard a deer or something, but I could tell by his face that he didn't think it was a deer. We got back to the conversation, but I could tell that Kevin was a bit on edge. After about 5 or so more minutes, I heard the sound, and I turned to Kev and saw him with the same look on his face from earlier, which told me that I had heard what he heard. I turned around to see if I could see anything, and much to my surprise, I did. I saw some movement off to the side. Someone was walking toward us. I mentioned that there was someone walking our way to the group, and everyone else turned towards where I was looking, all of us squinting to see who was approaching from the darkness of the woods. One of the guys even asked, "Who's there?" A man stepped into the light where we could finally see him, and he looked like a fairly normal guy. He was wearing jeans and a hoodie. He looked clean-shaven, and like he was just an everyday dude. My initial thought was that he was another camper that maybe had heard us talking, and he was coming over to visit, or something. He didn't seem threatening at first, just a bit out of place. Marcus stood up and asked, "Hey man, can we help you?" He sounded friendly but cautious, which told me that he was thinking the same thing I was. At first, the guy didn't respond. He just looked at all of us for a moment, kind of taking all of us in individually. Then he said, "I'm just passing through. Mind if I warm up by the fire for a moment?" Something about him put me on edge, but Marcus responded quickly with, "Yeah man, that's fine." The guy smirked and sat down by the fire, kind of away from the rest of us, and he just stared at the flames. Like, intensely stared. The four of us tried to keep the conversation going, but it felt kind of awkward. Like we were all talking over an uninvited guest. After a couple of minutes of just staring at the fire, the man stood up and said, "Thanks for letting me sit here. You folks have a good night." Without even a glance. He just started walking back the way he'd come. As he walked off, Kev kind of chuckled and said, "Well, that was weird, huh?" We all sort of laughed and agreed, but thought it was just a thing that maybe happened, and that we were going to move on. Just as we were starting to ease back into our relaxation, the sounds from earlier came back, but this time it was louder and more prominent. We all turned in the direction we thought it was coming from, and were all taken aback when we saw three guys all walking our ways, all wearing masks, and all of them armed. One of them spoke up as they approached. "All right, everyone, nice and easy. We don't want trouble. Just give us your valuables and no one has to get hurt." We all stood up and kind of huddled together. Normally the four of us weren't cowardly, but these guys all had guns, and they clearly meant business. Marcus tried to tell them that we didn't have much on us, that we were just camping for a couple of days, but one of the guys raised his weapon and said, "I didn't ask what you had. I told you to give us all of your belongings. Now empty your pockets and your bags." We all did as we were told, our hands shaking in the thought that we may actually not make it out of this alive plaguing us. They took our wallets, our cell phones, and literally everything else they could find. They even grabbed the cooler and took all of our food. After a few moments of them rifling through what we had, one of them nodded at the others and said something about that being good enough. The third guy then said something that made me nearly piss myself. "Should we go ahead and just put him down?" When he said this, I couldn't help but go into pleading mode. "Whoa, guys, come on now. You got our stuff. We're in the middle of nowhere. We all have families that'll miss us. Can we just call it good? You got what you wanted, right? No need to turn this into a full-blown homicide." I wasn't really sure what I was saying. I was just talking and trying to get them to move on without pulling the trigger. They all paused and turned to look at each other for a few moments, and then back at us. The one that asked if they should put us down kind of shrugged at the other two, and then one of them said, "All right, fine, but you all need to leave. If I ever see you around here again, you won't be so lucky." With that, they all started walking away with our stuff, and after a few seconds, they had melted into the night and were completely gone, leaving us shaken, but mostly unharmed. We sat there for a moment in silence, the four of us just thinking about what to do, when Kev finally said, "We should probably go." We all agreed. We put out the fire and packed up our tents, literally the only things we had left, and made our way back to where the car was parked. Thankfully, Marcus had the car's key in his pocket, and since it was an older car, it was just a plain metal key with no fob, and was small enough that they didn't notice he had it on him, because they likely would have taken that too. We got to the car, and when Marcus asked where we should go, I mentioned that a police station was probably the best bet, or at least somewhere close by with a phone so we could call 911 to report the incident. To this day, we still talk about that night whenever we get together. We've all pretty much refused to go camping since it happened, even though it's been over a decade at this point. None of our stuff was ever recovered, and I don't think the guys were ever found. I don't know if they were willing to go through with the plan of actually killing us, or if that was just a scare tactic. But if so, it definitely worked. We were scared. The whole thing felt like a wrong place, wrong time kind of situation, and my guess is that the first guy was the scout for the other three. Or I guess he could have been one of them and he was trying to see if we were worth the time. In the end, I'm just glad that we all made it out alive. Terrified, but alive, nonetheless. Hi. I, 22, female, have always been really sensitive to the paranormal. I grew up in a house that was very active. My siblings and I loved the paranormal and loved to go ghost investigating, or just go to abandoned buildings to explore, and we never really had big experiences until after the old rec center. I was having issues with my mom at home. We weren't getting along, and it was starting to get physical, so I moved in with my older sister for a few months. And during this time, my whole life and relationship to the paranormal has changed, and is definitely stronger. My older sister, let's call her A, she wanted to do a creepy photo shoot at an abandoned rec center. I think it was built in the 70s but got shut down for unknown reasons. We went and bought some white dresses and did my makeup like dark rings under my eyes, but anyway, we made it to the rec center and we had to go through a fence with a hole cut through it and find a door or window that wasn't boarded up or locked with metal bars. We finally found a broken door and snuck our way inside. We turned our phone flashlights on and started exploring to find a good place to take creepy pictures. As soon as we walked in, the air felt heavy, and I felt a lot of dread. But I just put it off because we needed these pictures. We ventured in, climbing over years of garbage and crumbled ceiling that had fallen. We stopped to put our stuff down so I would pose in a doorway to a hallway, when my foot slipped, and I fell. I was dumb because I was wearing sandals, not real shoes, because it would be easier to Photoshop out than a whole shoe, but I looked on the ground to see what I had slipped on, and lucky me, it was a piece of a Ouija board. The only word on it was no. The sides were burned. I started giggling in a panic and told A. She walked over and her face dropped. She grabbed my hand and we walked to a different spot. We went around taking pictures in different spots, like the old pool that was on the top floor, and very hard to climb to. We made it to a staircase that was cleared out, like it was dirty or covered in trees or anything, which was kind of unsettling for some reason. I stood at the top, and I went to go on all fours so it looked like I was crawling up the stairs, I guess. I was doing it right because A started laughing in excitement and told me to stop because I was actually scaring her. It was so good, and then I heard someone whisper my name from under me on the staircase. I panicked and jumped towards A, and I told her that I heard someone whisper my name. She told me to shut up because I was scaring her, and she asked if I wanted to go down there to the basement, all the way to the bottom of the 4-floor rec center. By the way, the whole layout of this rec center was really strange. Like, the pool was on the top floor, and there was a look down to the hot tops right below the pool, but the thing is, it was like a cliff. Like, there was no glass and no place to put glass, so it was a little strange. And the supposed to be hot tubs were 2 floors below the pool. And there was 3 of them, like right next to each other. And when we had ventured down there later on in the night, we found 3 weird rooms under the pool. They had the plastic strips on it, kind of like a walk-in fridge or freezer or a meat locker. And it was just a plain concrete room. There was nothing else in there. We thought maybe it was a sauna, but there was no place for the steam to come out or to go. Anyway, sorry. I told A that I didn't want to go to the basement, because I had a really bad feeling. She agreed and we grabbed our stuff, and started to head out of the building when my dress got caught on something, so it pulled me back. I cursed, looked down, and I could see the skirt to my dress being pulled back. I wasn't by anything for it to get stuck on something. I started waving my hand around it, thinking maybe a thread got stuck on something, but no, it wasn't. I started screaming and ran out. A was right behind me. We went home. looked at our cool pictures, which I'm still proud of, and a few hours later, A came up to me smiling and said that she wanted to go back tonight and explore the other half. I knew that she meant the rec center. I was nervous, but I said sure, and told her that I'm going to shower and get the makeup off, and when I was showering, the curtain had gotten pulled to the side like something was peeking at me. I laughed in nervousness and thought that it was just A picking on me, trying to scare me, but I washed the soap out of my hair when the curtain was pushed all the way. I screamed and started yelling. A came in running and asked what had happened, so I told her. We were kind of freaked out, but we pushed it aside, saying that maybe the wind blew it open. Later that night, we picked up my little sister V and A's best friend L. We brought flashlights this time, and when we were adventuring around, we went to the gym, and there was a huge pentagram burned into the floor. We walked around it to a door on the other side of the gym, and these rooms were weird, and we couldn't figure out what these rooms were used for. They were thick concrete rooms with the ceilings so far up that I couldn't see it. But the door was a small passage, not even 3 feet tall. I had to crawl on my hands and knees to even get into the rooms. I looked around the room to make sure it was clear so V could join me, and I noticed there was no other way into this room. So I told the others, and I told them that something felt off about this place and these rooms. When I said that, I heard something in the corner shuffle, like moving around. I hurried and flashed my light to the corner when I saw an old lady curled up. I gasped, panicked, and hurried and crawled out of there. I could hear her crawling behind me. I didn't want to scare V, so I didn't scream. I just looked at A and L and said, "Someone was in there, dude." They hurried and bent down to look, and of course no one was in there. We were kind of scared, but we kept on going because we were stupid. Eventually we found a staircase that led outside and downstairs, and when we were walking on the stairs, I felt a lot of comfort, like a huge hug. I was really confused, of course, but I wasn't going to complain. It was comforting after all. Once we made it to the basement, the whole vibe was super dark and heavy, and everything was burned from an old fire that almost destroyed the building. We kept walking and found the old laundry room. There was a mattress in there and a suitcase that had clothes in it, and a blanket. We were scared that someone was sleeping, and we didn't want them to get scared and try to protect themselves, so we called out just saying that we were sorry to intrude, and that we were just adventuring, but that we would leave them alone. No answer. So we kept walking. I was in the very back of the group, and I heard someone behind me whisper, "It's okay, Whit." I hit Elle and asked if she heard that, but no one did. I kept hearing footsteps and whispers. When we made it to the main location of the fire, and we found small pentagrams carved into the wood down there, but the weird thing is that they were the only things that were not touched by the fire. Which is impossible, because everything was pitch black burned. I had a strong feeling to touch one, and before I knew it, my hand floated up to the little star, and my finger traced the grooves. And let me tell you, as soon as I did that, I didn't remember anything else. I came back to when we were in the car to leave. After this night, my whole family has been affected by whatever followed me home. My best friend at the time was also affected, like not just paranormal stuff, like mental stuff. Our thoughts were super dark. One time when my friend was asleep, she woke up on her mom's floor, and her mom was restraining her. My friend came into her mom's room at 4 in the morning with a huge kitchen knife and tried to stab her own mother. I will admit that I almost took my own life, and my brother's. I would look at him and get so mad. I didn't understand why, but one day he was sleeping on the couch with his baby girl, and I found myself grabbing a pillow, and I was putting it on his face. He's a really deep sleeper, and he didn't wake up. What snapped me out of this was my baby niece crying. I picked her up and went outside to clear my head. when I felt a warm, comforting hand on my shoulder. I've done a lot of investigating and found out that this warm entity came from the rec center, and he also followed me home to protect me. I still have him here over 6 years later. Anyway, I tried to figure out his name with spirit boxes and stuff like that, but he doesn't know his name. But he does know that he did pass at the rec center, so I googled any deaths at this rec center, and sure enough, I found a teen that was running on the roof with his friends having fun. He didn't see the end of the building and fell off and passed away. They didn't mention his name because he was a minor, but I call him my buddy, and he's my guardian angel. He helped me fight off this really dark entity, but it's way too long of a story, and I just wanted to tell this part because it was creepy and unbelievable. Most of the time, I still doubt myself that it was real. Thank you, Raven, for reading my story. I appreciate you. And remember, everyone, you matter, and you have a purpose here. I wanted to share a story of something that happened to me back as a kid. This was back in the early 2000s. I believe that I was 7 years old at the time. My family was moving from Ohio to Pennsylvania to be closer to my grandmother, whose health had been declining at that point. Apparently, both of my parents were from the state as well, so they were looking forward to moving back. I had 4 older siblings and a baby brother, so while it affected my older siblings more, I was indifferent about it. I remember not really knowing what all moving meant or what it entailed, but I liked packing up all my stuff and the idea of getting a new bedroom. I shared a bedroom with 2 of my older sisters, and where we were going, I would actually get my own room. My parents said the house was much bigger, so maybe that's why I was so willing to go along with it too. We had been packing and cleaning for some time. My parents packed some of our clothing and toiletries in the trunk of my dad's car in the back of my mother's van, so we had stuff to immediately grab when we arrived at our new home. Then, on the big moving day, we had 2 big moving trucks over, loading up the boxes and bigger items such as the beds, couches, and chairs. My parents were delegating the moving people as to what needed to go where. My older sister and brother were helping my parents, while the rest of us kids just played in the yard to stay out of the way. They were moving around a lot, and at times they seemed a bit stressed. I tried to ask my mom for a snack, and she mentioned that she would have something in the car for us, and to get in with my sister. I went back outside and told my sisters that we needed to get into the car, so they made their way over to our mom's van. They continued to play together as they got in their spots. After they were in, I went to grab my carry-along toys from the yard. As I grabbed them, I watched one of the moving guys carry my mattress and bed frame into the truck. Being a kid, I was excited seeing my bed because I loved it, and I got this crazy idea of checking it out while I was in the truck. I had been in the bed of my uncle's truck before, and I thought it was fun, so I thought being in the back of the moving truck with my bed would be a blast. I walked to the back of the truck and saw my bed sticking out of the back, behind some boxes. I walked to the back and found my bed being used to hold up the mattress behind it. It was a small canopy bed, so I guess it was easier to use it as a stand instead of taking it apart. I also remember my parents struggling to put it together, so maybe they didn't want to have to take it apart either. None of that entered my mind at the time other than seeing my bed sitting there, so I jumped on it immediately. I had just been sitting on it when I heard someone walking up the truck ramp. I didn't want to be told to leave yet, so I laid on my bed thinking that I would be hidden. They tossed a few more things in the truck, and when I heard them walk away, I looked over and saw that they brought in the old recliner, a bookshelf, and a few boxes. This pattern repeated once more, but this time, after they tossed a few more items in, I watched the truck grow dark as they closed the door. I stood up to look around to confirm what had happened. Shortly after, I heard my parents saying something I couldn't make out, and my baby brother crying. Then I heard the truck starting. At first, I got excited. I was going to get to ride in the back of the truck after all. I ran back to sit on my bed, ready for the ride, but immediately the truck lurched forward as it went over the steep curb in our driveway, and the boxes on the side toppled over onto me. I was a very small child, so those boxes were very heavy. I really couldn't move. I'd been pinned under them, and that's when I became scared. I watched the 2 stacks of boxes by my head sway as the driver hit every bump, fearing they were going to fall on my head and crush me. I didn't know what was in them or how heavy they were. I just laid there scared with tears in my eyes as my ankles started hurting. I laid there for what felt like hours as they drove with nothing I could do about it. I had already cried some, and after playing for several hours and now this excitement, I grew tired, so I eventually fell asleep. I don't know how long I was asleep, but when I woke up, I felt the truck come to a stop. I could still hear other cars driving around us, and I could smell gas. I assumed we had stopped to refuel. I laid there hoping that they would open the back for some reason to check on me, but no one ever did. I became upset all over again when, after some time, the truck started up. So I was left to lay there some more. We seemed to drive for some time. I was hot and thirsty, as this was July, but with nothing else to do, I fell asleep again. The next time I woke up, it was just as dark, but this time the truck was off and still. For how long, though, I had no idea. I tried to move the boxes, but I think with the heat and the exhaustion, I was even weaker than normal and could not budge them. The grooves in the truck floor were digging into my leg and making it even more difficult. I laid there as time passed again, singing and counting as high as I could, just trying to entertain myself, until I finally heard shuffling and the truck door flew open. I tried to pull myself up some to see who it was, but I couldn't see over the boxes in front of me. But I didn't need to see who it was to figure it out. I heard my dad's familiar voice say, "Oh, damn it," most likely seeing the mess of boxes in the truck. As he approached where I was, I raised my arm and with a scratchy voice I called out to him. I'll never forget the look of shock and relief on his face, not to mention the yelp he let out when he realized I was in there. He immediately started moving the boxes and pulled me out, and scraping the back of my leg across the truck. I was happy to see him, definitely relieved to be out, but my dad was frantic. He was hugging me, apologizing, asking if I was okay. Then he said that they had been looking for me and asked, "Didn't you hear us calling for you?" But I didn't. I didn't hear my name once. He shouted out into what I saw was an unfamiliar house, saying that he had found me. My mom quickly came running to the garage, followed by 2 of my siblings, and my mom began hugging me as they both talked about where I was and what happened. They brought me inside the house, where I learned that this was in fact our new home. I had traveled the whole 4-hour drive in the back of that truck. They explained things to me later that day, as I also told them what had happened. As I got older, I could understand the severity of that situation, too. When it was finally time for us to go, the moving guys closed and locked up the trucks, and they drove them as my parents drove their cars. My mom had told me to get in the car as both my parents packed us in. They assumed that I was with the other. My dad knew that there was more space in the van, so he assumed I was in there, while my mom assumed that I went with my dad because I'm so-called a daddy's girl. They apparently didn't think to do a head count. At some point, the driver of the truck I was in stopped for gas, and even went inside to get something to eat. He was alone. My parents continued on their drive, wanting to get there soon, not as worried about the trucks. There was an understanding that they may have to stop for gas or food, and maybe even a hotel for a night. there was a possibility that the driver could have stopped at a hotel, and I could have been locked in there overnight. Thankfully, the man just needed to pick me up and carried on. Once they arrived, they discussed unloading that night or waiting until the next day, even though it would cost my parents another day. They decided to wait as everyone was tired and my baby brother was cranky. They all went inside, and when they were deciding on dinner, that's when I noticed that I wasn't with them. They looked all over the house, thinking maybe I was exploring, but they couldn't find me. They looked in the yard, in the two vehicles again, and still nothing. And that's when they started to panic. The movers had already left to go to a hotel, and they called them to see if they had seen me, and they said they hadn't. They even called one of our neighbors from our old place in Ohio, fearing that they could have possibly left me behind. But of course, the neighbor couldn't find me either. My parents had gone outside and started shouting my name and even called the police, all while I was asleep in the back of this truck. As they waited for the police to arrive, my dad went out to the truck, as the one I was in had bedding and some kitchen boxes in it, searching for blankets and cups. And that's when he found me. I learned that they had been at the house, sorting out their next steps, dinner and sleeping arrangements, and searching for me, all within about 3 hours. I had been in that hot, dark truck for nearly 7 hours. The police did show up, but they told them that they did find me, hiding in the truck, so nothing further ever happened with them, other than being greeted by the weird new family in town, I guess. So, that's the story of my thrilling and pretty scary ride to our new place, and my first moving experience. I know that this was a long time ago, but my parents definitely learned their lesson that day. They constantly did head counts and checked on us, especially as my little brother started walking. I also learned my lesson, and I don't like to go into places that can lock me in alone. I was lucky that it wasn't a longer period of time, or hotter, and that there was still some airflow, because the outcome of this could have been a lot worse. I have always seen things around that may be ghosts or spirits, usually cats, for example. I'll call my 3 cats in for dinner and see a 4th cat come in with them who quickly vanishes. Or I'll see one sleeping in the room near me and look to see who it is, and there's no cat there. There's phantom meowing, etc. And I seem to see shadows out of the corner of my eye more than other people do, and hear my name being called frequently when no one is there. But I never thought it was definitely paranormal until we moved here, about 1.5 years ago, and my mom started experiencing things too. We both hear heavy footsteps throughout the house, the back door slamming shut when it was closed and locked with no one in the room. My 4-year-old brother's toys going off in the middle of the night, and random crashing and slamming noises. One day I was walking past the bathroom and heard my brother whispering, "Gotta hide, gotta hide," and moving things around, so assuming he was getting into something. I turned on the light, and he wasn't there. I looked behind the door and under the sink, and no one was in there. Then I heard his laugh outside in the front yard, and I got a weird, sick feeling. It was as though something was imitating his voice in the bathroom. Several times I've heard him running through the living room and crying and run in to comfort him, but he's not there. The other day I saw him reaching up to grab the hot pan off the stove, and I rushed in yelling for him to get away from the stove, only to hear him laughing behind me. I turned to see him sitting in the chair in the living room. Another time I heard my cat meowing at the back door in the laundry room, and as I went to let him in, I heard the door slam, like usual, and saw a tall woman in pajamas run across the doorway and into the corner of the room. I ignored it, and went to open the door for the cat, and out of the corner of my eye, I could see the woman pressing herself into the corner, like she was trying to stay out of my way in this small space. The other day, my mom picked me up from work and we were rounding the corner to our house. My mom saw a little kid in our yard. I didn't see them, but I looked around to be sure and there was no one. But as I was walking up the steps of the front porch, I felt the child's hand grab my leg. I turned around thinking my brother wanted me to hold his hand up the stairs and saw him playing on the opposite side of the yard. No one was near me. Now, the story that made me want to submit this happened last night. I was in my room with my cat, Pumpkin, and we heard my brother's barn house toy going off in the living room. Usually it does 3 animal sounds, about 3 seconds apart, and then a 10-second song. This time I heard the sheep sound, off in the living room as usual, and then a few seconds later the cow noise coming from under my bed. Pumpkin and I both jerked our heads to the foot of the bed in confusion, and then the rooster goes off, still under my bed. We stare at each other in disbelief. As the song started playing, still under the bed, Pumpkin's ears flicked back and forth as though she could not comprehend what was happening, and she glanced from me to the bed, to the door leading to the living room, as I rushed to the foot of the bed and started looking for the toy barn. I moved the cat beds, moved my bed away from the wall, lifted the box spring. It wasn't there, and there was nowhere that it could fit inside of my room where I couldn't be able to see it. As the song stopped, I looked back at Pumpkin and she was still glancing around the room. I went to pat her back and tell her it was okay, and I heard the animal noises start up again in the living room. I looked out my door. The barn was sitting in the middle of the floor, where it had been all day. Usually I would just brush it off, but since my mom started hearing things, I've been paying more attention. And now my cats are reacting to it, so I can't just deny that it's happening anymore. We are planning to move soon to be closer to the rest of our family, so hopefully whatever lives here leaves my cats alone until then. Sorry if this isn't a super interesting story, but thank you for reading anyway. And if you choose to use it for a video, thank you for that too. I really love your videos, and I listen to them while I draw and do chores and stuff. Thank you for your awesome content. Well, thank you for submitting the story. This happened over 10 years ago, so unfortunately I can't remember all the details or what exactly was said, but I do remember how terrifying the experience was. To explain why I acted, or more accurately didn't act, I'm autistic and suffer from situational mutism. It was a bonfire night, and I was at a fireworks display with my family. I went outside ahead of everyone else and sat in my mom's wheelchair, waiting for the fireworks to start. A little while later, a woman I had never met before left the pub and made her way over to me, carrying 2 drinks and speaking as though she knew me. So, me being me, I just assumed that she must have been a friend of my mom's. I smiled as she handed me one of the drinks, but I didn't start drinking it. It was beer, which I don't drink, so I continued my habit of assuming and guessed it was for a family member. Then things got weird. Instead of telling me who she was, and that my family were on their way to join us, she began saying and doing some really unsettling things. Like I said at the beginning, I can't remember exactly what she said, but I remember her commenting on how shy I was. And then she began hugging me and kissing the top of my head. Even if I was someone who was okay with physical contact, which I'm not, I would have still found her behavior disturbing. After a while, she noticed that I hadn't touched the drink, that I now realized was mine, and she told me to drink it. By now, I was certain that she wasn't a friend of my mom's, and there was no way I was drinking something handed to me by a stranger. I began pretending to drink and considered my options. Looking back, I could have gotten out of the wheelchair and run back inside, but at the time, I was frozen where I was. It was crowded, and the woman was acting so strangely. All I could think to do was call my mom, so I began fumbling for my phone whenever the woman wasn't watching, and leaving missed calls to my mom, hoping that it would get her to come outside. Unfortunately, it didn't. By this point, a man joined the woman, and I felt completely closed in by both of them. The entire time, the woman's actions and mannerisms made me think that she might have taken something stronger than alcohol, but the man seemed completely sober. All I could think was, there was something in this beer. I was still pretending to drink it, and thank God this wheelchair is an electric one and they wouldn't be able to try to push it away with them. I left my mom constant missed calls, and tried to look around for someone to grab the attention of, when finally my family came out of the pub to join me. At that exact moment, both of the creepy strangers vanished into the crowd. If their behavior hadn't been enough of a red flag, this definitely convinced me that they were up to something shady. I never saw either of them again, but as we were leaving and I explained why I had left so many missed calls on my mom's phone, one of my brothers said that a woman matching the description of the creep had made some creepy comments to him too, earlier on when she was still inside. I don't know it for sure, but I genuinely wonder whether those people were looking for a vulnerable girl to kidnap or even traffic. They never saw me stand up from the wheelchair, so I doubt they knew it wasn't mine, and my appearance and mannerisms unfortunately sometimes make me look like an easy target. I like to think that I've learned how to handle myself a bit better since then, but fortunately, I have not had another experience quite so terrifying since. Hello, Raven. I've been a subscriber since 2021, and I want to thank you for everything you do. Well, thank you. Moving day was one of the most stressful days I've ever experienced because of a single encounter. My family and I were moving to one of the neighboring suburbs into a larger house, since the needs of the family has changed. My grandparents moved in with us, and there are 5 kids in the family, not including myself. Needless to say, we have a lot of stuff. There was a U-Haul out the front that would need to make multiple trips back and forth to deliver all the furniture and boxes. Since I'm one of the older siblings, and my parents trust me to be alone to get things done, I stayed behind to clean and get things ready to hand the keys back to Jeff, our landlord, who was also a family friend, who helped the family out during a rough time. Basically, we were homeless, and he gave us a place to stay. Jeff is pretty cool as far as landlords go. If we had any issues, he would have the issues fixed quickly, and nor did he randomly raise the prices, etc. I was standing chatting to him in the empty house when we heard footsteps. We looked at each other, strangely, because we didn't expect to see anyone else. We left some larger pieces of furniture that we didn't want to keep anymore, along with a couple of boxes of secondhand clothes for the kids to use, and some other random pieces too. Everything was still in good condition, but we just didn't want or need it anymore. Jeff called out, and we heard scurrying away. The pair of us walked to see what was going on. One of the boxes was open, the one that had old baby and children's clothing inside of it. Some pieces of clothing were hanging over the side. We called out, "Hello," to see if anyone was there, going from room to room to see if somehow somebody was in the house. In the empty side room, hiding in a small corner, out of sight if you happened to open the door, was a man whom neither of us recognized. He had a scrappy, unkempt beard, dirty clothing, and a pretty strong stench. He was holding pieces of clothing and rubbing his greasy face on them and twitching. I don't know what he was doing with the clothing. I really didn't want to know. We pulled him out of the house, as other than trespassing and some minor theft and being gross, he hadn't done anything that bad. At least, according to Jeff. However, the man still came back to the property. I was cleaning to ensure that we got our full deposit back. I was listening to music with my earpods in, vibing and enjoying myself. Jeff hadn't asked us to do a deep clean before we went, but it was pretty much a favor and I was happy to do it. I don't mind cleaning, and any excuse to get time to myself is treasured. I was dusting and cleaning the inside windows, and I nearly didn't see him. I jumped when I realized what I saw. It was him just squatting outside the window, staring inside. This time Jeff wasn't here with me. I told the guy to leave or that I would call the police. He stood there leering at me with a gross grin on his face. And that was when I noticed what he was doing with his hand, which was definitely inside of his pants. I'm trying to say this in the most polite way possible, and in a way that won't get you in trouble with YouTube. Let's just say his hand was wrestling with the one-eyed trouser snake. I remember the gross look on his face. He knew that he was freaking me out, and he had said something to me, but I didn't understand it, and I didn't come back to ask him to explain himself. I ran to another room, locked the door, and called the police. They didn't find him, but they told Jeff about what happened. He told me that he was going to install some security cameras since some of his family was moving into the house. I kept cleaning, but I was never there alone after that. During this time, I never saw him again. I took one final look at the old house, got in the car, and half expected to see him through the window or something equally out of a horror movie, but I didn't see anything. When I was settling in and unpacking in the new house, and I told the family about what had happened, the local grapevine warned people about the man and his creepy tendencies. He had apparently taken children's clothing off of clotheslines, and was found with it by the police. So far, he hadn't tried to touch any children or do anything weird with them, thank God. I wasn't physically hurt by this experience, but I was definitely creeped out. My sister purchased a home built in 1923. I automatically loved the little 2-bedroom stucco home. It had a full creepy basement, including a coal bin for the furnace that had been updated to steam heat. It had a fireplace and built-in bookcases, a tiny door in the hallway near the bathroom and bedrooms that was made specifically for an old candlestick telephone, and a little door kept it out of view with small decorative cut holes so you would hear it when it rang. Then you would place it in the nook to talk above it. I don't even know why I said it to this day, but I told my sister that I always felt her large living room and dining room felt happy. She asked what I meant, and finally I just envisioned that at some point the rooms had a group of happy friends in it talking, maybe playing cards or some sort of a club. Lots of laughing and talking. I had spent the night with her often since my university was way closer than where I lived, and we could talk or go eat that way, and I could crash there. One day, a girl I had a class with asked if there was any way I could take her home. I inquired where she lived, only to find that it was a hop, skip, and a jump from my sister's house, so I told her this. Going there, she said she'd known a lady who lived on that street. The more specifics we talked about, the more I realized it was the same house. So I drove right past it, and she pointed to her house, saying that either an aunt or grandmother had once lived there. She said that she had a card club that met all the time, and many happy memories were made there. I felt like saying I had seen and heard them in my mind's eye, but it would have sounded weird. I don't care about that anymore, so I'm telling you all. It was like some energy of them was still in the home, and it was always warm and fun, but yet the basement was creepy. One odd thing did happen there, and I figure it was a ghost or a demon voice trying to scare me, and oh yeah, it did. My sister was a nurse and was working second shift. I had a key and stayed overnight a lot, as I said. So sometimes I would make a run for some food at a nearby Taco Bell for a taco salad that I'd be craving. My sister's cat Sheba had to be the prettiest and sweetest cat in the world. She was a Norwegian forest cat with gold eyes and a striped mackerel silver coat. She was so sociable and sweet, and I talked to her and said, "I'm going just down the street to the Taco Bell to the drive-thru to get a salad and I'll be right back." I was right at that back door where I parked nearby, keys in hand, and Sheba was right by the door. She turned her face up to me in a sweet little voice. I heard, "Okay?" I couldn't move out of fear and disbelief. And then I closed and locked the door, gunned to my car out of there, and got my food and feared going back. I was petrified. That can't be the cat. A ghost? Worse, some kind of demon? I felt that I was just shaking in fear. It took everything in me to return. I've never taken a drug in my life, and I assure you that's the truth. I probably would think that someone was a bit off if they told me that, but it happened. And it scares me to think of it many years later.